Hello, everyone. Welcome to my podcast. I'm Jon Oltsik. This is the Cybersecurity Bridge. For those few of you, there are 8 billion people in the world. For the few who have not seen this podcast before, it's broken into 3 sections. Each episode is broken into 3 sections. The first section, we'll talk about the present of a particular area of cybersecurity. The second section, we'll talk about the future area of that particular area of cybersecurity. And in the third, it's the cybersecurity bridge. How do we get from the present to the future? And I'm really psyched because I've got a guest on today that we've been trying to do this for a while. Just an expert in the field of vulnerability and exposure management. Scott, I know I'm not doing you any justice with that introduction, so can you introduce yourself to our audience?
Sure. Yeah. Hello, everybody. My name is Scott Kuffer. First of all, just so excited that, it was my life's dream. When I was 6 years old, I would wake up. I was asked, what did I want to be when I grew up? It was the vulnerability management expert with Jon Oltsik here 20 years from now. It's going to be great. But my name is Scott. I'm one of the co-founders of a company called Nucleus Security. We specialize in what, has had many different names over the years, but where we're starting to settle is exposure management. And it's all about consolidation and unifying these things that we now call exposures that I used to call vulnerabilities. And it's been a great time, but very fortunate, had a lot of success, and super excited to be here, John. So thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming. And I'm glad you mentioned Nucleus Security. I failed to do so. But before we move on, Scott Kuffer, are you ready to play cybersecurity trivia?
I'm always ready to play cybersecurity trivia, and I'm a little scared of where this is going to go. But
well, this might be down Broadway for you. So last year, there were over 40,000 vulnerabilities reported. And so the question is, what year did the NVD, the National Vulnerability Database, what year did it record over 10,000 vulnerabilities for the first time? Now, was that 2016, 2017, 2018, or 2019?
Oh, that's a great question. You're right. I should know that because 2016 was the first year I did vulnerability management. And so that should be an easy one. I know we're at about 340,000 CVEs now. We did about 40,000 last year. It's been going up in kind of a linear progression. So, I mean, it's not out of the question to say that 2018, 2019 timeframe is where we first started to see the rapid acceleration. Well, I'm going to go with 2019 because I feel like it has exponentially increased the volume of what we've been seeing out there in the market. So that's where I'm going. And also the CVE program's gotten a lot better at reporting and kind of keeping up to a degree. So anyway, 2019, locking it in.
Okay, so this is just a testament to how bad things are, that you're wrong, but it was 2017. And there were 14,645 CVEs reported that year. So it really speaks to why we're here and why this is such an important topic, Scott.
Absolutely. Always something to learn.
Oh, sorry about that. So moving on to the present, I listened to, and by the way, to the audience, if you haven't seen Scott and Steve, his co-founder at Nucleus, their podcast called VulnWise, strongly suggest that it'll just be additive to everything we talk about today. But I listened to a podcast yesterday, and your guest said the key to vulnerability management is understanding the battlefield. So how well do we understand the battlefield today?
Oh, yeah. So that's our friend Johnny Shaeb, who's been at IBM for many years. He's their chief exposure management, chief architect at IBM. He's super knowledgeable. He's been around for a long time. But to answer the question directly, we really don't know the battlefield. And I think a lot of that really is coming down to the fact that the tech stack is changing so dramatically. And vulnerability management is the downsides and the difficulty of it compound a ton, especially compared to even just the basics. So what you think about was vulnerability management, first step is actually asset inventory, right? It's about what do we have? What are we going to scan? If we're looking at our discovery systems. And then you start looking at that, and just that is a nightmare. There's an entire industry that has been created in the last 15 years just around asset inventory. And, think of even the old school land sweepers from back in the day, right? We have so many of these challenges just at understanding our own infrastructure much less understanding the risks on that infrastructure and then how all of these things tie together. It really is a compounding exponential problem. And we, as kind of just exposure management and VM practitioners, really think that's the main first step, is just to understand what you have. And I don't want to emphasize that as like, oh, just start and know what you have. That's a very difficult problem, but it's just one of the many multitudes of problems that you have in a VM response. But you can't really get started until you even know what you're kind of looking at and what the lay of the land is. And I think Johnny was making the point of kind of that Sun Tzu type of old school methodology, because he likes to apply some of those historical, kind of methods and models to the world. And it's accurate, right? If you don't know what the lay of the battlefield is, then you really can't take your appropriate action. Everything else becomes a 50-50 guess and shot in the dark.
Yeah, absolutely. And I like the Sun Tzu reference. I can't tell you how many papers or articles I've written and referred to that quote. But part of another thing he said was that it's all about data aggregation and data normalization. And you're right, we've had an industry spring up on that. But where are the sticky points today? What data is difficult to get? What data is difficult to normalize? And are there blind spots still?
Oh man, yeah. So as the founder of a company that does this, I should probably be out here talking about, oh my gosh, we're making a ton of progress as an industry, and this is awesome. But the reality is, it's still kind of a mess. Is the reality, and the reason for that is that you have a bunch of distributed vendors whose job it is to try to discover vulnerabilities. And there isn't even broad agreement on naming conventions across different categories of risks and assets and vulnerabilities. So I think about something simple, right? Even just hey, we've deployed a container image repository to a particular registry, and then we're going to deploy it on a AWS account over here and an AWS account over there. AWS itself is not like aware of its own asset in its own system, just across the context of one thing. And so when you start to blow that up across different types of systems, you think about all the CSPM out there, ASPM, IT, OT, data, DSPM's now a thing. You've got identity is now a thing. You've got AI and configurations and compliance and different types of categories of findings. We're very, just as an industry, not good at it. Then I think the reality is it's doable, but it's a lot more expensive to do than people expect, right? They think, I'm just going to build a few integrations, I'm going to map some stuff together, and then we'll go on our way. And that's where the giant glacial snowball hits you in the face about 12 months in, and you go, man, we really do need specialized tools that all they focus on is normalizing all of this data. And even, I can't go a whole interview without talking about AI. Even with the generative AI technologies available today, they're not really able to handle the volume and the variety of the information into a definitive data normalized model. But these are all things that we're actively looking at over time. But it's not great, John. I guess that's the short answer. Is it's not awesome.
Yeah, this isn't a lot of sunshine and rainbows, this discussion. But so I'm going to get on my soapbox for a second, Scott. Why is it this bad? Because to me, the industry would be much better off, and certainly our customers would be much better off if we had standards on naming conventions, standards on data formats. Why isn't it better, and why aren't customers just demanding that the industry get together and put standards together?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think that it, like with all things vulnerability management, similar to how you're not the one fixing vulnerabilities, you're also not alone in being able to solve these broader industry problems. And I think it really boils down to three distinct areas. The first is that the naming conventions as we know them are not sufficient for the overall industry as a whole. And so what has happened is you've had these private vendors and private parties kind of making it up as they go. So I think about even the difference between, we have the CVE construct. That's great. How do you deal with misconfigurations in a cloud environment? And how do you associate that across with a CVE and decide what you're going to fix? So a CSPM vendor is having to now use a CIS benchmark or a NIST benchmark that are not directly tied to CVEs. And so there hasn't been unification of the standards, and we're seeing this continue with SBOMs and the VEX format as well, frankly. So we're kind of going down this path of siloed, I'll call it siloed normalization at just the global industry level. And we're seeing this even now that China has their own national vulnerability database. And so there's a lot of this has to do with the ineffectiveness of where we've gone with NVD over the years. And I don't mean that as even like a really poor, like NVD is doing a bad job. This is a really tough problem, but it's more like it just hasn't manifested in the way that I think folks wanted it to when we first came up with the idea of NVD. And, there was that whole kind of debacle late last year, I guess middle of last year, around funding, like who's going to fund NVD? Is it going to go all private sector? I mean, we're already seeing private vulnerability databases come up. And so it's starting to become a pay-for-play industry. So that's I think, part of it. But at the same time, when I first got started in this market, every single vulnerability management vendor, so think scanners when I think vulnerability management, they all wanted to be the iPhone of vulnerability operations and remediation. And so like none of them even had APIs you could use. So it was this whole thing where every vendor wants to be the number one platform, but every single company in the world doesn't use a single platform. And so you just have this disconnect between the market and the customer, or the market and the companies servicing the market. And then when you have that disconnect, there wasn't a whole lot of standardized training around how to do vulnerability management correctly. So it's kind of been like the black sheep or the redheaded stepchild of the industry. And, there's not a whole lot of training out there even today. It's all vendor driven, right? Like Nucleus Security's vulnerability operations training is like the closest thing outside of one single SANS course that exists about how to do vulnerability management. So you just have this kind of distributed, I call it the Roomba effect. Everybody's kind of doing their own thing. We're all bouncing off each other, bouncing kind of in general random directions. And we don't have like a top level guidance around where this market should go.
Yeah, I've often said that the security industry is the battle between altruism and capitalism always wins.
I like that a lot. That's cool.
So let's move on to the future, and we could actually, this is a present and future thing. I mean, vendors, Nucleus, other vendors are working hard to develop algorithms for risk scoring. Are we chasing something that really will work in the future, or is really risk scoring sort of a platform for customization, and every industry, every customer is going to have a little bit of a different angle to it?
Yes, this is a topic that I love, because we, even internally at Nucleus, we debate, we talk about this all the time, because you have this really interesting dynamic between different organizations in the market, where some organizations in the more regulated space, they have very specific ways they have to do prioritization. And that is, auditable third-party risk ratings. And then you have other folks that are just looking for advice on like, what should I do, right? More in that mid-market. Some just outsource to an MSSP and they don't even think about it. They're just like, hey, MSSP, you handle this. I don't really care. Just make me secure. And so the broad spectrum of maturity is what makes this so challenging, because what we see with risk scores, and this is, now we're deviating into my personal opinion here, not just the factual.
Go for it. Come on.
All right, perfect. So my perception of what risk scoring does is it is a portion of prioritization. So we have spent so many years focusing on these lists of vulnerabilities. Show me this vulnerability and it has the biggest impact to my business. It's the biggest single hole that I need to plug. But that's not how businesses operate. Businesses operate in buying down risk capacity, right? So unless something is on fire and there's like a Log4j or a public-facing shell shock on my environment, most organizations care way more about, well, is my patch Tuesday going to go through, and is there a way I can tack on some additional patches to that process and fix 50% more vulnerabilities? So prioritization and risk scores as a whole, they're cool, but kind of, it's almost like if you've heard the term bike shedding, I view it very much kind of like bike shedding. It's like we're spending so much money across the private sector, Nucleus included. We have a risk score and risk scoring algorithms to prioritize the top 2%, just like 2% better. And we're over here going, but you could fix a lot more by reducing the cost of fixing vulnerabilities. And so you have to balance both of these two things at a prioritization level. So that's my way of saying that it's kind of going down a path that it probably has some value to it. I'm not saying that it doesn't, but when you look at the juice, I feel like we've squeezed a lot of the juice out of that path already, and we need to start thinking bigger about vulnerability prioritization and what we fix as a whole.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. That's what my research is saying. And now we're on to the future, and we're kind of toe dipping in the future anyway. So I've been doing a deep dive, some other research on the healthcare sector. And on the one hand, the technology innovation and deployment of healthcare technology is incredible. And I think in 10 years, healthcare will look nothing like it does today. On the other hand, it scares the heck out of me because of the growth of the attack surface. So in the battle between vulnerability management and attack surface growth, where do we see that going in the future?
Yeah, it's a really fascinating question, and I'm very lucky. I get to participate in a lot of these higher level conversations between public and private sector partnerships, right? And so, actually, I was just at Black Hat last week, and so that was really fun. But what was interesting was getting to go to some of these events that have a lot of folks from the government that are responsible for trying to figure out some of these answers. We were even talking 15, 20-year out types of conversations. It's fascinating. There's people working on projects today for, time series, time bomb bugs in critical infrastructure in 2050 type of scenarios. Like, it's really, really fascinating. And so I think where the consensus is right now is that the attacker pace is continuing to increase, and it's going to continue to increase. And a lot of these newer technologies are only going to make that happen faster. And so we need to come up with a different frame of the model on the defensive side to address that. And so there was this concept that I've heard about, and I don't know who came up with it first. Sometimes I think I came up with it, and then other times I'm like, there's no way I came up with it. Somebody else said this before me. But the concept of vulnerability debt. So I've always had this kind of weird feeling that, from 2016 to about 2022, it was hey, only 2% of vulnerabilities matter. We are going to help you figure out how to prioritize the 2% that matter. And I'm like, well, what about the other 98%? Because all the data shows that the stuff that matters, the stuff that doesn't matter right now will matter in the future. So you're kind of accruing this risk surface that we're just actively deciding not to work on, and we're okay with that. But what happens when I can only fix 2 out of every 10 vulnerabilities, but then 3 out of every 10 vulnerabilities becomes a thing that we have to, that now really matters. So now we're going to start accruing really bad technical risk debts. And so how do we address that? And so when we're looking at the future, I really feel like it if you think at a bigger level, it becomes an economics problem across the industry. How do we buy down risk at scale? And how do we do that in an efficient way? And so there's all these like really crazy studies. I don't know how much stock I put in them, but it can cost anywhere from $100 to $50,000 per vulnerability to fix, depending on kind of levels of effort. And like an average enterprise is in the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, and millions. And like just economically, you can't justify spending $50 million to fix vulnerabilities when you're trying to operate a business. And so we have a responsibility to flip that on its head and say, well, what's the most effective way to reduce the cost to actually fix things? And it's not all about vulnerabilities. It's about how you interact with the business. It's about how you communicate. It's about your vulnerability strategy. And so it's this really high level conversation and question that's very, very fun to dig into.
Yeah, and we haven't even talked about exploitability yet, where 27% of CVEs are exploitable. But before you go there, you brought it up before, the whole freaking industry is talking about AI. So if you look 2 to 3 years out, not 2050, 2 to 3 years out,
Sure.
What will AI be good for? And what do you think we're just totally off base talking about AI in this context?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, I'm going to have to take my sunglasses off that I was having to wear at Black Hat so that I could get the words AI on the neon signs, burned out of my eyes. Because I don't think I walked by a single booth that did not have the words AI on it. And yeah, so this is one that I've always feel like I have a slightly different perspective than a lot of folks. And, everybody is either like way on the super, oh my gosh, doom and gloom, like AI is going to take all our jobs, all the way over to, hey, this is a super intelligence that's going to make awesome capabilities for all of us. But if we're really looking at 2-3 years out, we are very familiar with AI tools here at Nucleus. I mean, we're very early adopters internally on this stuff. And you can see the iteration and the development. But what you look at is that I think that the hype associated with the potential is how we're dictating a lot of our thinking today versus where is it at and actually modeling out the kind of where it's going perspective. So if you look at, the last 6 months, there's not a lot that you would look at that says, okay, well, the models themselves have completely changed the game again. There was like the world before generative AI and there's the world after generative AI. And then it's become iterative at that point. They're great iterations, like awesome stuff. But the real value and the real game changer is going to be the tools that you build around the AI. So I'm very excited about the ecosystem. So it's not necessarily ChatGPT that changes the game for the business, but it's the augments and the cursors and the codexes around ChatGPT or Claude that really change the game. So 2-3 years from now, I think that I'm going to echo something that Bob Joyce, ex-CISA director, has been saying a lot, which is AI is being leveraged by attackers, and that's going to continue to happen, and it's going to make attackers move faster. And we believe that effectively the best way to counteract that is to find the ways that AI can help level the playing field between attackers and defenders. So I do think that next 2 to 3 years, we will start to see some very fundamental shifts in our SaaS ecosystem, right? It's a very tech-heavy cybersecurity industry. It's also a very people-heavy industry. And so, I mean, one example, I actually have a great example. I don't know if people are going to like this example, but I like this example, which is if you look at even like the market around threat intel, right? Threat intelligence has been done one way for a long time, human analyst driven, and that's cool. But can you deliver 95% of the value of a threat intel platform for 2% of the cost using some type of AI technology? And not everybody's going to buy that, but maybe it's enough to create a lower market opportunity so that it's now threat intel is available to the lower end of the market and not just enterprises. So these are the types of dynamics that I think are going to fundamentally shift the cyber industry that might not just be, oh, AI is doing all the remediation for us. It kind of shifts the ecosystem.
And so the back half of that question is, where is it just hype and you don't believe it? So is that like in asset contextualization? Is that in prioritization? Is that in automated workflow? Where do you see people talking about use cases, but based on your experience, you're saying, no, that's not going to happen?
Most of them, to be honest. That's so...
Great answer.
Yeah, I think what's happening is that there's a dynamic of we don't want to be left behind in the cyber vendor space. And so everybody is sort of just throwing everything at the wall right now, trying to say that it works. And so like I even think about like an AI chat interface to ask questions, right? We used to have search. We used to have natural language processing. It just wasn't as sophisticated as our natural language or as our AI is now. But it solves a lot of the same problems that natural language search did previously. And so all of these things were attainable, really. And it's like, it just was the amount of effort and the investment to make it a reality. And we're not all Google, so we can't all invest a huge amount of money in natural language processing, right? But I do think that there's a lot of extra hype around like auto remediation. I hear so much about auto remediation and like auto patching. And I'm like, well, there's an entire industry around auto patching now. And so it's specifically, it's a nuance, right? It's not just about the auto remediation. It's about the fact that we think some new company that is just only AI focused and only agent focused is going to come in and be that AI auto remediation. When why wouldn't a tool? Now, granted, the companies have to uphold their end of the bargain and innovate and reinvent themselves, but why wouldn't a Big Fix or a Microsoft or some of these tools that already handle patch management make it easier and layer the agentic workflows on top of the existing platforms and tools to make it happen? Because everybody's like, oh, wow, the low cost of the low barrier to entry makes it easy for the market to kind of upend itself. But the flip side to that is that the low barrier to entry makes it really easy to actually change the whole innovator's dilemma. So this is something I've been thinking about a lot. I'm going to take this like startup world for a second. The innovator's dilemma is like this core concept, like, the bigger you get, the less likely you are to kind of disrupt yourself because it's where your cash cow comes from. But we're looking at this even at Nucleus and go, well, actually, because it's such a low barrier to entry, the investment for us has decreased by 95% to go run these experiments, and we can speed it up. And so the barrier to entry actually makes it easier. And I think that the innovator's dilemma as we know it actually is kind of at risk as a model, which is pretty interesting to think about because it decreases the barriers to entry for everyone, not just new folks.
Yeah, there's I think it was Gartner who said that there'll be a unicorn startup where the staff is one person. So we'll see where that goes.
That could be true, but I don't know which founder wants to do marketing and sales and products.
You know better than I. So let's go on to the cybersecurity bridge part now. So getting from the present to the future, I saw you speak in Florida about kind of best practices on vulnerability exposure management. So I went out and did my own research. I talked to a dozen CISOs. You and I have been talking about technology a lot, but they really dwelled on skill sets and process. So forget technology to get to the next level of efficiency, effectiveness. What has to happen in terms of skill sets and processes?
That's a great question. So one thing that I've had the fortune to be able to kind of draw a connection between, because I've gotten to do both. I was a vulnerability management person and I've also been product, right? So I run product here at Nucleus. And one of the things that was so apparent from the beginning was that vulnerability management is almost identical in terms of what you're doing to a just run-of-the-mill product management function, right? You have deadlines, you have shifting due dates and SLAs, you have shifting requirements, you have to model out levels of effort. Your entire job is about prioritizing, and then you don't fix anything. You have to work with other people to get stuff fixed, right? And so it's a really fascinating kind of connection to draw because we have a whole system and ecosystem around product delivery, but we don't have a similar construct for vulnerability delivery. We have these high-level models, but nothing that's literally, hey, you need to adopt a Scrum process that has these 5 ceremonies, and this is how you deliver, and here's the principles behind it. We do not have that as a vulnerability operations kind of just industry. And so that's an area that when you saw me speak in Florida, that's a kind of where that focus was. What does that vulnerability operations model look like? And so it's really fascinating when you really start kind of digging into it. And you're kind of at a disadvantage compared to product too, because of just the dynamics of product is making decisions with 10 engineers that they have to manage. In a traditional enterprise, it's around 250 engineers to every one vulnerability management person. And so some of the dynamics are kind of crazy there when you think about it. So you can't scale that with just people. You would need an army of people to be able to adopt an agile kind of methodology to it. So that's where the tech comes in. But as far as skill set goes, I mean, being able to project manage is probably the most important thing. Being able to just understand who do I need to talk to, unblock myself in the organization, and being able to communicate upwards is, to me, the thing that is just the unsung hero. How do you get your CISO bought in? How do you communicate to the board about what's going on and the actual real risk that you have available to you? And then honestly, if you can tie that to some sort of data science background, oh my goodness, you can unlock so much just in your organization, because you need to be able to communicate with the engineering managers at the level of an engineering manager. You need to be able to explain how this relates and connect vulnerabilities to the business, and then connect the business down to the engineers. And then you need to be able to do the same thing on the risk side, because you're not the GRC team. So you need to be able to communicate and translate vulnerability technical risk into something that other people understand. So communication skills is huge. Being able to understand data is huge, because this is really a big data problem, but we're not sending our big data experts onto vulnerability management generally. And so big data, it's communication, and then it's strong project management to keep things on the rails and pushing forward in all the little areas of the process, because it's really a business problem as much as it is anything else.
Yeah, and you just your answer just kind of stepped into my next couple of questions, so I'll try to summarize. But you've been at this a long time, and of course with Nucleus, you're working with a lot of big customers. Is there any kind of special, I don't know, trait or special practice that you see with customers who really get it?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, because the reality is the people who really get it are just the ones that have tried to solve it before, which is crazy. It's almost a little bit like oh man, like I've been burned before by trying to solve this problem. And then people catch the bug of, man, I really have to solve this. And so it's just, I mean, the biggest trait of folks that are successful really are ones that have tried it before more than anything else. And, there's all the normal stuff that you would see from a trade perspective, but I kind of equate it to, it's the same thing that you get with the best business people, the best engineers. They deeply care about the mission of solving the problem, and they're basically just like dogs with a bone. They will not stop until they can push it through, because there's friction at every single step of the process. There's friction in, hey, like I tried to prioritize a thing. The engineering team, number 7 over here, didn't agree with my prioritization methodology. So now I have a whole sub project to like get them on board. Oh, I did a threat modeling exercise to figure out how we should bundle patching together. And, oh man, the CISO doesn't understand and doesn't appreciate that. So having tenacity is huge. It's a huge trait that I would look at. And the only way to get it is the people that really understand what they're stepping into. You have so many folks that this is their first job in cyber, and they just came out of a cyber degree, and it's like getting hit with a truck when you first try to figure out how to do a thing, because it's hard to be successful in a VM organization.
Yes, you pointed that out in Florida, and I think the example you said is, here's something that has business impact, and you put 2 or 3 of your lowest skilled people on it. That is a recipe for failure, and it's time that the industry recognizes that. So that was a really good point.
No, it's a thing. I think I bring this example up all the time, but it's even thinking about the vulnerability scanners, right? It's like the vulnerability scanner purchase is not a purchase the CISO generally is like, I'm going to take point on this vulnerability scanner purchase. I'm going to delegate that down. I'm going to delegate it down. I'm going to delegate it down. And then eventually it's like the junior intern who's here for the summer is the one who has to evaluate, do I want Tenable, Qualys, or Rapid7 as my core VM process? And you're like, okay, that's cool. That's fine. But then those same people get pulled into actually being the ones that have to fix stuff, because there's nobody else who has like ownership of that process. And so you just naturally kind of consolidate all of these folks that are just being thrown into the fire, and they don't know business, right? You need experience to understand the business context. And so it's like, that's where you rely on these CVSS scores and severities coming from these different tools, and you don't really know what to do. And so it becomes very tricky. And I feel bad, honestly, for some of these, basically these kids that get thrown into the fire. But it's just a consistent pattern I see. It's, some dude named Doug is the VM expert, and he's a 23-year-old, mathematician from Carnegie Mellon, right? It's like, go have fun, Doug.
Poor Doug.
Yeah.
So I'll just editorial on my part is, when I did my research with the CISOs, it was absolutely what you suggested. It was putting the work into the processes. It was getting the business to buy in. It was making sure there were good lines of communications across the board, because as you say, we security people discover vulnerabilities, we may prioritize them, but we don't fix them. So it's all, that was really the eye opener for me, was all of the kind of soft work, organizational work that goes into this. So Scott, before I let you go, because as we talked about before we got on, we could talk for hours and hours about this, but we don't have infinite time, nor does our audience have an infinite attention span. So I ask this question all the time. I'm sure you do on your podcast, but if you had to give our audience one piece of advice on what to do today to get started with a very high quality best practices vulnerability and exposure management program, what would that piece of advice be?
Oh, the one thing I would always suggest is start with what you have, right? It's like everybody gets bogged down in my asset inventory isn't perfect. I don't have the buy-in of the CISO. I don't have all of the tools available to make a huge impact. But I will tell you that you can make a huge impact with just what is your reality today. And it's just changing your mindset on what you're going to do with it. So, hey, I can only prioritize a small subset of my vulnerabilities effectively because I only have a certain amount of context and integration with the rest of the business. That's okay. Start with that and do the best that you can in the moment that you have, and then build a plan to increase the scope, right? I call it the blueprint method. It's focus on what you can control today, build an end-to-end workflow inside of a small scope. If anybody is familiar with CTEM, you can pick a scope that way. You can also just pick a business process, or you can Maybe you have a friend over in some part of the business who's willing to put some pressure on their teams and test something out with you. It's really that simple. You got to get started somewhere, prove the value inside of a small scope, and then branch it out one by one from there. If you try to bite off the whole enchilada right out of the gate, it's going to be at a high risk of failure. And you'd be surprised at how far you can get, and you'd be surprised at how quickly you can get promoted if you are able to show value in these kind of small, specific areas of the business. And next thing you know, you'll be a VP who runs all of vulnerability management, because we need more of those.
Well, that's good career advice, if nothing else. And so, Scott, thanks so much. You really know your stuff. Again, audience, look for the VulnWise podcast. If you like this podcast, it's well worth paying attention to. So, Scott, again, thanks.
Thanks for having me, John. And thanks, everybody, for listening.
Yeah, and I'll be back again in 2 weeks with another episode of the Cybersecurity Bridge.